When we look at the data coming out of Israel over the past 14 months, we're not seeing isolated problems. We're seeing the convergence of multiple structural crises that, when combined, create what I would call a perfect storm scenario. And the most concerning aspect is that many of these trends are accelerating, not stabilizing. Let me start with the immediate economic impact, because the numbers here are stark. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, 2023, Israel's economy contracted by 4.1%. Now, for context, that's not just a bad quarter. That's the kind of contraction you see during major financial crises. But what's more telling is what happened next. The first two quarters of 2024 saw continued declines of 1.1% and 1.4% respectively. Business gross domestic product, which is often a better indicator of actual productive economic activity, fell by 4.8% in the second quarter of 2024 alone. By any standard definition, Israel entered a recession. Now, the Bank of Israel has estimated that the total cost of this conflict will reach $67 billion by 2025. To put that in perspective, Israel's entire gross domestic product in 2023 was approximately $520 billion. So we're talking about a war cost equivalent to roughly 13% of annual gross domestic product spread over just 2 years. That's an enormous fiscal burden for any economy to absorb. But here's where it gets more interesting from an analytical standpoint. The debt to gross domestic product ratio has surged from 60% in 2022 to 69% in 2024. That's a 9 percentage point jump in just 2 years. Now, 69% isn't catastrophic in absolute terms. Many developed economies operate with higher debt ratios. But the trajectory is what matters here. The velocity of change, and more importantly, the credit rating agencies are watching this very carefully. Moody's downgraded Israel's credit rating from A2 to Ba1 in September 2024. That puts Israel just one notch above junk status. Before the war, Israel held an A1 rating. That's 3 notches higher. 3 downgrades in barely a year is virtually unprecedented for a developed economy that isn't in the midst of a sovereign debt crisis. And Moody's maintained a negative outlook, which signals they're seriously considering further downgrades. If Israel drops to Ba1, it enters junk territory. That would trigger automatic sell-offs from institutional investors who are restricted from holding non-investment grade securities. The borrowing costs would spike dramatically, creating a self-reinforcing debt spiral. The former chief economist of the finance ministry, Yoel Nave, has publicly stated there's a high probability of a financial crisis within 3 to 5 years if fiscal discipline isn't restored. When a former government chief economist makes that kind of public warning, you need to pay attention. These aren't the words of a critic or an opposition voice. This is someone intimately familiar with the government's fiscal position, making a technical assessment based on the numbers. Now let's talk about what's driving these costs, because it's not just military expenditure in the traditional sense. Israel has called up approximately 318,000 reservists between October 2023 and July 2024. These reservists served an average of 110 days during that 10-month period. Compare that to the peacetime average of 10 to 13 days annually. You're looking at roughly 10 times the normal reservist burden. A Ministry of Finance study found that the economic cost of a reserve soldier is approximately 48,000 shekels per month. That's about $13,000 at current exchange rates. So you're not just paying military wages, you're paying for the displacement of these individuals from the productive economy Many of these reservists are business owners, managers, skilled professionals, tech workers. When you pull them out of the economy for 3 to 4 months at a time, the knock on effects are massive. Businesses lose key personnel. Startups delay product launches. Projects get abandoned. Contracts go unfulfilled. And here's the critical part: only 11% of eligible Israelis aged 23 to 47 actually served during this period. That means the burden is falling on an increasingly narrow slice of the population. You're creating a situation where the same people are being called up repeatedly, which compounds the economic disruption and creates severe equity issues within the society. Those who serve bear disproportionate costs, both financially and in terms of career disruption, while others continue relatively normal economic lives. This isn't sustainable, neither economically nor socially. But I want to pivot now to what I think is actually the most critical long-term threat to Israel's economic model, and that's the brain drain we're witnessing. From October 2023 to July 2024, 8,300 tech employees left Israel for long-term relocation. That represents about 2.1% of the entire high-tech workforce leaving in just 9 months. But the total immigration picture is even more severe. Approximately 90,000 Israelis left the country from January 2023 to September 2024. That includes hundreds of PhDs and medical doctors and thousands of engineers. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you need to understand Israel's economic structure. Israel's economy is not diversified in the way that large economies like the United States or Germany are. Tech represents a disproportionate share of economic output, tax revenue, and export earnings. High-tech industries account for roughly 18% of Israel's gross domestic product, but generate about 50% of exports and employ about 13% of the workforce. More importantly, tech workers pay disproportionately high taxes because of their income levels. They're funding a significant portion of government revenue. When you lose 8,300 tech workers in 9 months, you're not just losing employees. You're losing future innovation, future startups, future intellectual property, future tax revenue, and future economic dynamism. And for the first time in at least a decade, Israel's high-tech workforce actually contracted in 2024, declining by 1.2%, which represents about 5,000 employees. That might not sound like much, but remember, Israel's entire tech ecosystem is built on continuous growth, both in headcount and in productivity. When that growth stops or reverses, the implications cascade throughout the economy. Think about it from a human capital perspective. These aren't random immigrants. These are exactly the people every developed economy wants. Young, highly educated, entrepreneurial, globally connected, high-earning individuals. They're moving to places like the United States, Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom. Once they establish themselves in those markets, buy homes, enroll their children in schools, build professional networks, the likelihood of return diminishes dramatically. Even if the security situation improves, you've lost a generation of human capital. And here's what concerns me most from a structural perspective. Brain drain creates a negative feedback loop. When the most talented people leave, it signals to others that leaving is the smart move. It reduces the density of the innovation ecosystem. It makes it harder for startups to recruit. It makes international investors more hesitant. It reduces the tax base, which forces the government to either cut services or raise taxes on those who remain, which incentivizes more people to leave. This is the dynamic that has hollowed out numerous middle-income economies over the past several decades. Greece experienced this, Portugal experienced this, parts of Southern and Eastern Europe experienced this. Once the cycle begins, it's very difficult to reverse. Now let's turn to the international dimension, because what we're seeing is Israel's integration into the global economy being systematically unwound. Start with tourism. In 2024, Israel received approximately 1 million visitors. Compare that to 4.9 million in 2019. That's an 80% collapse in tourism. The number of airlines operating in Israel dropped from 250 before the conflict to only 45. Most major international carriers have suspended service indefinitely, not temporarily, indefinitely. That includes many European airlines, Asian airlines, and some North American routes. Tourism is not a trivial sector. It employed over 200,000 people before the conflict and contributed billions to gross domestic product annually. Hotels, restaurants, tour operators, transportation services, retail in tourist areas, all of these sectors are experiencing depression-level conditions. And unlike a cyclical downturn, there's no clear catalyst for recovery. The security situation would need to improve dramatically. And even then, rebuilding Israel's reputation as a tourist destination would take years. But the tourism collapse is just one indicator of something broader. Israel is becoming increasingly isolated in the international system, and that has profound economic consequences. In November 2024, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, you can debate the legal merits of those warrants, you can debate the politics, but from an economic standpoint, what matters is the practical effect. All 125 member states of the International Criminal Court are obligated to arrest these individuals if they enter their territory. That includes all of Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, most of Latin America, and significant portions of Africa and Asia. What does this mean practically? It means Israel's prime minister cannot travel to most of the developed world without risk of arrest. That constrains diplomacy. It constrains trade negotiations. It constrains Israel's ability to participate in international forums. It sends a signal to international businesses that Israel is becoming a reputational risk. Companies are increasingly wary of being associated with jurisdictions under international legal scrutiny. We've seen this pattern before with other countries facing international isolation. Investment declines. Joint ventures become harder to establish. Supply chains get rerouted. Financial institutions become more cautious. In September 2024, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly for imposing sanctions on Israel for the first time in 42 years. In November, 52 states called for a military embargo. Now, these aren't binding resolutions, but they indicate shifting international sentiment, and sentiment matters enormously in economic terms. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, these institutions are increasingly under pressure to divest from Israeli assets. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which had limited economic impact for years, is gaining mainstream institutional support in ways it never has before. In December 2024, Amnesty International concluded that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. They based this on 9 months of investigation, interviews with 212 people, and extensive evidence analysis. Whether you agree with that conclusion or not, the fact that a major international human rights organization is making this claim has enormous reputational and economic consequences. It provides political cover for governments and institutions that want to reduce economic ties with Israel. It influences consumer behavior. It influences corporate social responsibility decisions. It influences where venture capital flows and where pension funds invest. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not making a political or moral argument here. I'm making an economic analysis. From a purely economic standpoint, international isolation, regardless of whether you think it's justified or not, has severe costs. South Africa during apartheid provides the historical template. International sanctions and divestment didn't cause immediate economic collapse, but they created a slow, grinding pressure that constrained growth, increased cost, reduced access to technology and capital, and ultimately contributed to economic and political change. The economic isolation happened gradually over decades, then accelerated rapidly in the late 1980s. Israel is obviously not South Africa, and the situations are not identical. But the economic mechanisms of international isolation are similar. You see it first in reputational damage and diplomatic constraints. Then you see it in reduced foreign direct investment, then in trade barriers and complications, then in financial sector caution and higher borrowing costs, then in technology transfer restrictions, then in talent outflows as people seek opportunities in less constrained environments. Each of these individually is manageable, but when they compound over years, they fundamentally alter an economy's trajectory. Now, let me bring this back to the fiscal situation, because everything I've described so far feeds into the government's fiscal position, and that's where the real crisis risk lies. Israel's government faces a fundamental math problem. Revenues are declining because of economic contraction, brain drain, reduced tourism, and general economic disruption. Meanwhile, expenditures are exploding because of military costs, reservist compensation, security infrastructure, and reconstruction. The gap between revenues and expenditures has to be financed somehow, which means issuing more debt. But as debt levels rise and credit ratings fall, the cost of borrowing increases. That means more of the budget goes to interest payments, leaving less for everything else. At the same time, Israel faces enormous social expenditure pressures that predate the current conflict but have been exacerbated by it. The ultra-Orthodox population, which largely doesn't participate in the workforce or military service, is growing rapidly and requires increasing social spending. The reservist burden is creating demands for compensation and benefits. Infrastructure that's been damaged needs rebuilding. The education system needs funding. The healthcare system needs funding. These aren't optional expenditures. They're essential for social cohesion and basic functioning. So you have declining revenues, rising security costs, rising social costs, and rising debt service costs, all happening simultaneously. Something has to give. Either you raise taxes substantially, which further incentivizes brain drain and constrains economic growth, or you cut spending dramatically, which means cutting social services, infrastructure, investment, or security, all of which are politically difficult and economically damaging. Or you continue borrowing and hope the situation improves before you hit a debt crisis. That third option is what most governments choose, but it's also the most dangerous because it assumes the problems are temporary and will resolve themselves. The question facing Israel is whether these problems are temporary or structural. If this is a temporary security crisis that will resolve in the next year or two, and if economic growth can resume, and if brain drain can be reversed, and if international isolation can be contained, then the fiscal situation is manageable. The government can borrow its way through the crisis and grow its way out of the debt burden. But if any of these assumptions prove wrong, if the security situation remains unstable for years, if economic growth remains subdued, if brain drain continues, if international isolation deepens, then the fiscal math becomes very difficult very quickly. And here's my assessment. Based on the trajectories we're seeing, these problems are more structural than temporary. The security situation shows no clear path to resolution. The economic data shows no signs of robust recovery. The brain drain is accelerating, not slowing. The international isolation is deepening, not easing. The fiscal position is deteriorating, not stabilizing. When you map out the likely scenarios over the next 3 to 5 years, most of them lead to serious economic stress. Now, I want to be careful not to engage in catastrophism. Israel has a highly developed economy, strong institutions, a skilled workforce, technological capabilities, and strategic alliances. These are significant buffers against economic crisis. Israel has weathered serious economic challenges before and demonstrated resilience. The question isn't whether Israel will disappear or collapse. The question is whether Israel will experience a significant economic shock that forces painful adjustments and potentially alters its long-term development trajectory. What would such a shock look like? Most likely, it would manifest as a fiscal crisis. Government borrowing costs would spike as credit ratings fall further. The government would be forced to implement harsh austerity measures, cutting social spending and public sector wages while raising taxes. This would contract the economy further, creating a vicious cycle. The currency would likely depreciate significantly, making imports more expensive and reducing living standards. Capital flight would accelerate as wealthy Israelis move assets abroad. Brain drain would intensify as economic opportunities diminish. In this scenario, Israel wouldn't collapse, but it would face a lost decade or more of economic stagnation, declining living standards, social tension, and reduced geopolitical influence. Think of Greece from 2010 to 2020. The economy contracted by 25%. Unemployment exceeded 25%. Youth unemployment exceeded 50%. Living standards fell dramatically. A generation of young people emigrated. The country required international bailouts with harsh conditions. Greece is still recovering more than a decade later. Could Israel face a Greek-style scenario? The mechanisms are different. Greece was trapped in a currency union and couldn't devalue. Israel controls its own currency, which provides more flexibility. But the underlying dynamic of excessive debt, declining growth, and international pressure is similar. And Israel lacks some of the buffers Greece had. Greece could rely on European Union support and funding. Israel's international support is narrowing, not expanding. The alternative scenario is that Israel implements serious fiscal reforms, manages to achieve some form of security stabilization, retains enough of its tech sector to drive growth, and muddles through with moderate economic pain but no crisis. This is certainly possible. It requires difficult political decisions that may not be feasible in the current environment. It requires some reduction in security costs, which may not be achievable given the security situation. It requires maintaining enough economic dynamism to generate tax revenue, which may not be possible if brain drain continues. My assessment is that the probability of a serious economic shock in the next 3 to 5 years is higher than the probability of muddling through successfully. Not certain, but probable. And the longer the current trajectories continue, the higher that probability becomes. The window for policy correction is narrowing, the fiscal buffers are eroding, the international environment is worsening, the human capital base is shrinking. These are not trends that reverse easily or quickly. What makes this situation particularly challenging is that the economic crisis is intertwined with security, political, and diplomatic dimensions that are largely outside the control of economic policymakers. An economist can recommend fiscal consolidation, structural reforms, and growth policies. But if reservists are being mobilized continuously, if international isolation is deepening, if talented people are leaving, then traditional economic policy tools have limited effectiveness. You can't cut your way to prosperity when you're fighting a multi-front conflict. You can't grow your way out of debt when your workforce is being drained and your international market access is shrinking. This is why I characterize the situation as a convergence of crises. No single factor would be catastrophic on its own. Israel has dealt with wars before, it's dealt with fiscal pressures before, it's dealt with international criticism before. But when you have all of these factors intensifying simultaneously, and when they reinforce each other in negative feedback loops, the risk of a serious economic shock increases dramatically. The coming years will be critical. If Israel can achieve some form of security stabilization, implement credible fiscal reforms, retain its tech sector, and prevent complete international isolation, it can avoid the worst outcomes. But each of those conditions is challenging, and all of them need to happen together. If any of them fail, the economic trajectory becomes very difficult. And right now, based on current trends, most of them are moving in the wrong direction.